All right. So go ahead and click OK on that disclaimer to make that window go away, and we'll get started. Thank you, everybody, for joining me this morning. I know this has been an interesting last few weeks with wondering when we were actually going to have the forms, but which is why I kind of delayed a little bit. I wanted to make sure I got a chance to really read through them and wanted to make sure that these were actually going to be the forms that we're going to be going to battle with. So I'm still grateful that we're getting them before the August. Well, they say the cutoff is August 15th, but most of our MLSs are taking a commission out of the MLS in the first week of August. So we're going to need to be prepared to use these probably in the next 2 weeks. And so all these forms should have dropped at like midnight. So they should be in the library this morning. I'll be candid, I did not have time to check, but as soon as this class is over, I'm going to go into SkySlope and start updating all of our templates. So I'll be able to make sure everything is there. But let's see, let me let one more person in. Okay. And does anybody have any questions before we get started? All right. All waiting with bated breath, I can tell. Okay, well, we'll get started. We're going to go ahead. I'm going to share my screen so that you can see, so that you can see the documents we're working with. Is that big enough? Can you guys all see it, or is it too big? Give me a thumbs up. Looks good. Okay, great. Awesome. Okay, the very first form I'm going to pull up that I've got pulled up here is the broker compensation advisory. This is going to be attached with the listing agreement and with the purchase agreement. And no, I take that back. With the listing agreement and with the buyer rep agreement, it will become a part of those packages. But the reason I wanted to show you this form first is that I'm going to ask each and every one of you to sit down and read this. It's very important, and it's a 2-page form. I'll make it a little smaller so you can actually see how much I'm asking you to read. It's like 5 paragraphs. It's not, or it's 7 paragraphs. It's not that much. But what it is a script for you guys. If you're having a hard time explaining this to your clients, this is the form you want to use. I sat through and read it this morning again, just before before I started the Zoom. And really, this thing's going to be your guide as you're sitting down and talking to clients about what the compensation looks like and what the changes are. As a matter of fact, on the very last page, there's even a paragraph that talks about the lawsuit right here. This talks about why we've had to make these changes and what's happening. So we're going to get into this form briefly. I'm going to kind of just go through the bullet points, but I'm going to suggest that each of you sit down and read this and use this as your script for going through the buyer representation agreement, and even for going through the listing agreement with your client so that you can have some guidance on how to explain it. This will be my script. This will be the document that I use to guide me through the conversations with my buyers and sellers as we're signing contracts. The first thing you need to know is it talks about listing agreement compensation. The DOJ is making us put in here that it is fully negotiable, which it always was. I don't know what the difference between negotiable and fully negotiable is, but it's always been negotiable, and it is still fully negotiable. They really like that word because they've added it in here in this little paragraph down here in this section as well. So it's not fixed by law. It is fully negotiable. We have optional additional compensation if a buyer is unrepresented. So one of the things you're going to notice in the listing agreement is that they had every single scenario for every way we could possibly get paid. All the offers. Sorry, guys. Let me mute her. There we go. Okay. So all the offers of compensation to the buyer's agent, all of those offers out of the listing agreement have completely been removed. So we're going to get into what that conversation looks like, because it is going to change the way we have to do things. It's going to change the way we've had conversations, because not all of those pieces are going to be in the contract, but we're still going to need to discuss them as far as I'm concerned. But what this paragraph talks about is what happens if the buyer is unrepresented. And what that means is, it means that if I'm not representing you, like you don't have another agent representing you, and I as a listing agent am not representing you. What does that look like? Normally, you and I both know that we have people that when we take on that responsibility, we still do twice the work. So there's a place in the listing agreement for you to put in what happens if the buyer is unrepresented, which means you don't have a buyer representation agreement with them, and no one else does either. Because you and I both know you're going to end up doing some extra work. So this is a great paragraph to help you explain that to the client. The next paragraph, C, the broker may represent both buyer and seller. that is just, it's proof for you in writing that dual agency is allowed in California. And it does say California allows a brokerage to represent both buyer and seller. So if anyone ever questions it, this is where it says it in writing. Then the next section down, section 2, broker agreements with buyers. Again, guys, as you're struggling with those conversations, this is the place to come get your verbiage. Buyer representation compensation, again, is fully negotiable. Requirement for written agreements, and this talks about pursuant to the class action suit that we do have law that says that we are required to have a written agreement. So if somebody says that's not necessary, you don't have to have that, well, we actually have it on paper that we do have to have it, and this is why. So if you want some help with explaining that to clients, this is a good paragraph for you to know well. Advantages of written agreements. This just talks about why written agreements are good and what they do and how they help to make things clear. When enlisting a real estate broker to represent them, buyers agree to pay the broker when escrow closes, but the person responsible for payment may be negotiated in the transaction. I might, for somebody that's a newer buyer, I might even highlight that paragraph. I love that it's in red here for us, but it won't be on the documents. It's going to be in black. But I might even highlight that paragraph so that we can really get in and talk about that, you know, because that's one thing on the old buyer rep agreement that people used to get scared that it said that they had to pay the 3%. So we would like highlight the paragraph that said that you didn't have to pay. I still feel like it doesn't say that. It doesn't say that this way in this document anymore. But I do feel like this could be a very helpful place to just skip right to when you're in the client to show them that it says in writing that we can have somebody else negotiate this. And then it talks about the buyer paying the compensation pursuant to the buyer representation agreement, seller paying the compensation, what that looks like, what happens if the buyer negotiates the seller to compensate the buyer's broker, and what happens if the buyer's agent negotiates with the seller directly. These 2 paragraphs, I know you probably have never done number 2 in this paragraph or in this document. So I would suggest you read this and get very comfortable with it. I also suggest that if you're not comfortable with it, you come sit down and talk with me, like me or Ben or anyone else. Like, let's sit down and have a conversation about what this conversation needs to look like with your client. There's some couple different things that we haven't really talked about before, and I think these two paragraphs, this section 3B in particular, will really help you to be able to explain to your buyer how we're going to ask the seller to make that compensation, what that looks like. The one thing that's important in here, it does mention that you can use the C.A.R. SP, which is a single party compensation agreement to the buyer's broker. But one thing I do need to let you know is that the CBC form is going away. It's gone. As of today, there is no cooperating broker compensation agreement form. And I will tell you, that is the form that as we were doing all the trainings in the last few months, I kept saying, man, I feel like you guys are going to end up using this a lot. I feel like you're going to end up using this a lot. Well, no, you're not. It's not going to happen. And the reason that the DOJ came back and wanted to make additional changes is because what they were hearing in conversations from realtors is that we were going to find ways to work around what they were trying to get us to stop doing. And taking away the CBC form is one of the ways for us to ensure that we're not doing workarounds. It means that you truly have to have a contract negotiated with your buyer in order to present it to the seller, or as a buyer's agent. Now we can negotiate that directly with the seller through the listing agent prior, but it has I don't necessarily know what the form looks like for that, or what it looks like, other than you have a conversation, have something maybe in an email that comes back that says this is what we'll agree to, and then you would put it on your buyer representation agreement. It's going to be a little tricky in the beginning with some of this stuff, guys. So don't hesitate when you're in it to sit down. Each scenario will be a little different. We can sit down and figure it out together, but just know that the CBC, the cooperating broker compensation form, is gone. That also, when that used to come in handy for us, is if somebody had a pocket listing and we wanted to show it to a client. We heard about it. Let's say that Craig has a pocket listing. I have a client that I want to show it. I would have Craig's client sign, or I have Craig sign the CBC, the cooperating broker compensation agreement, saying that he was going to pay me my 3% or 2.5% or whatever was negotiated upon, whatever we had discussed. But that form's now gone. So you have to do it as the buyer's agent. You have to do it through your representation agreement with your client, which is the buyer. Again, we could talk around in circles on that, but I just thought that was important to make it before we move on. And then the paragraph C here is changing practice related to seller's broker of offer of compensation. we talked about this at the beginning. This paragraph just helps you to explain to the client why all these changes took place, why everything is different, and why it might be different than the last time they purchased a home. And so I'm going to just suggest, guys, you get really familiar with this form. When you look at it at first glance, there's nothing to change on it. So it tends to be one of those forms that we just package in with everything else and never think about and never talk about. But I really do suggest that this is going to be a helpful form for you. Even if you just have the client sign it, read the form, learn the form, and use the information in it to be able to deliver the message to your client, if that makes sense. Or sit down with the client and actually review this form with them as you're doing your buyer representation agreement or you're doing your listing presentation. And I think that will be very, very helpful for you guys moving forward. I know it'll be helpful for me. I will be using this form with my clients as I go through the process. Any questions on this form before we move on? To make sure, hold on, let me make this bigger so I can see all your faces.
When exactly this goes into effect in August, right?
Well, the form is available today. All of the new forms dropped 7/24, which is today. So it will be a part of the listing package, the listing agreement and the buyer representation agreement, and it should be there now. Like I said, I didn't have time to check this morning, but today's when they drop, and so I'm gonna go in and update all of our templates today to make sure that everything's included. But you should have access to this as of today through SkySlope and Form. All right, any other questions on this one? Okay, we are gonna move on. So the big question I've been getting from a lot of people is, what do I do with my current listings? All this stuff changes. Do I have to have new listing agreements? The answer is no, you don't have to have a new listing agreement. What you can do for all of the current listings that you have is fill out a DMLA, which is disclosure and modification to a listing agreement. And this says right on it that it's intended for use with an RLA that was revised, the RLA revised 1223 or earlier. So the last version of the RLA that you would have been using, any of your current listing agreements, should be the one that was created December of 23. You can use this, and what this does is this explains, if you kind of look at the red verbiage, it says it will note the offers of compensation will no longer be available on the MLS, that you may be asked to deal with compensation in other ways. And it refers to the C.A.R form BCA, which is the one I just showed you guys, as to how to explain that information. So I would suggest that if you're going to do the disclosure and modification to your listing agreement, if you're going to use this form, that you put the BCA with it. Even though it's part of the listing agreement and the buyer rep agreement package, you can pull it separately from Zip Forms or SkySlope. So you could include those two forms to your client. And I think it would be a good idea. If you've got clients that don't have questions and they're like, we're good with all of it, then maybe just use the DMLA. But if they do have questions, maybe bring in the BCA as well. Oh gosh, what was it called again? The broker compensation advisory, so that you can review that with them and help them to understand it. But yeah, if you don't want to modify, if you don't want to do new listing paperwork, I have a listing that's a lease listing that I've actually had for a year and a half. I am going to do new paperwork on that one just because I just want everything new. I need new disclosures, and there's some new things for leases that I don't have on him anyway. So some of you may choose to do all new paperwork on your listings if you've had them for a little while, but if you don't want to, this is the form that you're going to use. And again, it is the DMLA. Then the next one we're going to take a look at, be prepared because this has got lots of red on it, is our residential listing agreement. Can you guys see that okay? I'll make it just a little bit bigger. So for any of you who were in any of the classes over the last week where we reviewed the new forms, everything is pretty much the same as what we last looked at. The place where we get into the big changes, I wish I could highlight this, but it's not letting me. The place where we get to the big changes is section C, the compensation notice. This is where, again, we used to have what was going to be in here was 4 options. What's in here now is 2 options. The only things you're considering and concerned with in the agreement are the compensation of the seller's broker. So only the seller side of the transaction. So this is where you would write in 3%. Again, I'm going to speak in very black and white terms. It's just what we normally do. So 3%. And then the the next section here, you would have to check the box for it, and that would be additional compensation to the seller's broker if the buyer is unrepresented. So again, if you don't have a buyer rep with them, if they don't have a buyer rep with anybody else, if the buyer doesn't have a representation agreement with anyone else, how much additional are you going to charge the seller? So this, you would, in most cases, I would say we would put in 3% here. Let's just say you were going to do it at 2.5 and 2.5. You could do that too. But there's not really a place for you to negotiate. There was going to be, and I'm not quite sure why they took it out, but there was going to be a box in here that said what the commission was going to be if you represented both sides. But they've taken that out because they want the buyer's agent, even if that's you as the listing agent, but they want you as the buyer's agent to now negotiate your commission with the buyer. So putting it in here pre-negotiates it with the seller. So they're asking us to do that with the buyer and then bring that back to the seller. But I'm going to tell you guys, this does not mean we don't need to have this conversation. We need to share with these sellers that in most cases, this has been customary for many, many, many years. And that in most cases, the buyer's going to be asking for this amount. And if they don't, if our price that we're going out at is based on the comps that are out there when everybody was offering 3%, that buyer is probably going to expect that we're going to bring the price down by 3% for them. That's why they're not using representation, right? And so you and I both know that when we do these transactions and we have an unrepresented buyer, we still do all of the work. We still have to get them to sign everything. We have to chase them down. We do essentially end up acting as their agent in some way, shape, or form. But you can also do a flat amount, or you can attach a compensation schedule. So let's say I've seen sometimes where it's like if the sale price is over $1 million, it will be 2.5%. If it's under $1 million, it'll be 3%. Sometimes there's a bonus that can all be put into here as well. And then we have the continuation of right of the compensation for broker identified prospective buyers. So this is generally on the current listing agreement. In the template, I have 180 days in there for you. So that gives you 6 months after the end of the expiration of the listing agreement or cancellation, that you would have 180 days to be paid on anyone who you represented. There's also a form, BIPP, it's broker identified property something, that you can use at the end of a term to list the names of your buyers. We can also just do it in an email where you send a letter to the client, but if you want to put it on a form and it makes you feel better, like there's a really great form you can use to list out all the properties you've shown. This is going to get important because of the exclusive, non-exclusive checkboxes in the buyer representation agreement and what's required to get paid on those. So we'll get into that a little bit further down the road. We're still talking about listings now, but just know that there's a form out there that you can use for that later to show the seller who the buyers were that came through the property while you were representing them. Seller's obligation to pay previous brokers. This is just where they would tell us if they have any obligation to pay anyone else. Do they have a contract like this with a previous listing agent? Are there still any open obligations to pay for any clients that were shown the property? That's a question we should all be asking at listing time. I know all this stuff is all in red, but we've all looked at it before. It's not different from the last classes we taught. I'm not going to go into it because this doesn't have anything to do with compensation. I don't think there's anything in here that we need to cover that you haven't already seen. I do still love that everything's in the grid format, so all of the important data is pulled to the front of the contract and we don't have to go searching for it. Timing of presenting offers, all of this is the same. Does anybody have any, I'm going to scroll back up here for just a sec. Does anybody have any questions on this section, or how we're going to discuss this and how we're going to explain this to our sellers? Do you guys feel like it's a pretty straightforward conversation, or does anybody feel like they're going to hit a speed bump, or they're worried, or they're concerned, or have any nervousness about it? I love you guys. This is great. Awesome. I will say this. I'm much more comfortable with this version of the listing agreement than I was the last one. The last one, I told you guys, I think in every class, I said you guys are going to have to get used to explaining this front page because I can't even do it without flipping up with all the different ways you could get paid. As much as I hated it when I first heard it was happening, I look at it and I'm like, no, this actually makes way more sense to just discuss what our side is, and then when the other side comes in, we completely negotiate it. What it also allows us to do is negotiate stronger, because we can negotiate stronger for our seller. Mr. Seller, rather than saying you're going to pay 2 or 3 or whatever percent, let's wait to see what the buyer's agent asks for. Maybe they ask for 2. Maybe they ask for 2 1/4. Maybe they've already pre-negotiated this down for themselves. We can wait and see what comes. And then my job as your agent is going to be to negotiate the best possible deal for you, and make sure that we get to a quick close, right? So let's see, and more than one more person come in. Okay, there we go. Real quick. Okay, perfect. So any questions on this before I move on?
One question that I see where you can put, how much for the seller and the buyer, and what happens if the seller says, hey, if you double ended, I'd like it to knock it down from 6% to 5%. How would that be indicated under other terms, or is that here? If you're double ended?
Well, there's not a place in here for it, because again, that was supposed to be, it was originally it was like C3 or C4. It was one of these options where there was a place to say, if I double end, then I'll do it for 5%, or I'll do it 2.5, 2.5 is what it actually showed. So you could, but I mean, if you were really going to do it, I would just go ahead and put it under J, under additional terms. But technically, what we really should do is, when the buyer comes along and we have the opportunity to represent them, and after we've had a conversation with the buyer about what their situation is, right? I think it's only appropriate then to go talk to the seller about what the commission is going to look like. And I think that's where the DOJ is trying to get us to go. And the reason that there's a couple other brokers there was a broker sounding board meeting yesterday at C.A.R that we had like 110 broker managers at, which I think is the largest number of managers I've ever seen come to a meeting. I saw people I have never seen at a meeting before at this. And what we started talking about, people were trying to find well, what do we do? Where do we write it? Where do we put it? And what we kind of had to slow down and say is, the reason the DOJ came back in and changed the forms again is because we were trying to do workarounds. And so if we keep trying to do workarounds, they're going to keep coming in and making this harder and harder on us. So if there's a way that we can explain to the seller that, my commission, not only is my commission for the list side negotiable, it's also negotiable on the buy side. So a thought just came to me how I might explain this is that if I'm taking a client and I'm selling their house and then I'm going to rep them on the buy side, I can't really reduce my commission on the buy side. Well, I couldn't before, right? I don't control that. The other side controls it. So I could sometimes give them a discount on the purchase side. I would give them a discount on the listing because I'm not necessarily going to be able to give them a discount on the other side. That's just what commission is offered to me. But what we could do is tell the seller, listen, if I do double end, then I would only do the contract. let's say this is at 3% and you want me to drop both sides to 2.5, then I would write the buy side at 2%. And that gives you a net of 5. That's what you would get if it was 3 and 3, right? I don't think we have to negotiate that up front. If the seller wants to know if we will, and they're only comfortable if it's written in the contract, you could, but I wouldn't make it a standard practice. If that makes sense. If the seller's like, no, I want it in writing, okay, I'll put it in writing. Another thing you can do, and we've said this before, I will always be happy to do it. You can always email me and say, hey, Steph, my client has just asked if I would be willing to if I double end this listing that I have at 123 Main Street, would I be willing to do the buy side at a reduced commission? And I said, I would like to do it at 2%. My response back to that email would be, yes, it's approved. Then the buyer has something in writing, or the seller has something in writing that they can put in their hand that we've said that we will do it. It's not written into the listing agreement because there's not really a place for that yet. We don't know who that buyer is going to be, or that's really the essence of what we're trying to get across, that we don't know who that buyer is going to be, so we don't know what the commission will look like yet. And maybe you will have just a set amount that you charge, and if you do, then at some point you may, and a buyer comes to you and says, hey, I want to purchase this house, but they're not willing to pay your commission, you may have to step back and let them go buy it without you. You know, that may be a direction that we have to go in at some point. I know we're going off on a tangent from the listing agreement, but these are all conversations you have to have with the seller about what it's going to look like when we're talking with the buyer. I think they need to be educated on both sides of this as well. So there's not a place in the contract for it to go. If you really wanted to put it somewhere and the seller was like, I want you to write it in here, you could put it in section J, but it's really not what that's for. It's meant to be negotiated through the other side of the contract, but that's probably where I would do it, is on the buy side. You could reduce that amount. Does that make sense? Any other questions? Okay. I don't think there's anything else in here that we need to cover today, but I will say that this section 4, compensation to the broker, is another really good section for you guys to read and go through and make sure you understand it. If I did this with you, we wouldn't get through all the forms I want to get through today, but I think this is a really good one. I will send out copies of these drafts after this meeting is over, so you all have everything that what I sent out the other day in the original email was just some of the main forms. I have some extra ones in here that after this meeting is over, I'll send them out with the recording so that you guys all have them to review. I like the draft versions because I love the red. It shows me what to look at and I don't have to go read the whole contract. So I'll make sure you guys all get copies of these today. There's lots of stuff in here about compensation. All the stuff in red is things that have been added. So it's a good idea to go back through and reread some of these and get yourself familiarized with it. But for the most part, it's all common sense stuff that most of you know. So don't get yourself super overwhelmed with it. It's pretty light and easy reading. Let's see, let me pull up my little folder that's got my forms in it that I want to look at. There we go. Okay, so oops. Guys, there we go.
Steph,
Yeah.
for our existing listings, when do we have to take the compensation that's showing in MLS out?
It will automatically be taken out on August 5th for C.A.R, and I believe the date is the same for GPSR. You don't have to take it out. It's automatically going to come out.
Okay, perfect. Thanks.
All the MLSs are going to shut it off. The only thing we just need to do is make sure that we're explaining to our clients, to the sellers, that it's no longer shown in the MLS. That's what that have I shown it to you?
So are we able to advertise it on social media and emails and other advertising, just not the MLS?
Yes. Yes, you can.
I thought they were trying to ban it from any advertisement at all at one point.
They're not. The only thing we can't do is we can't have because with Better Homes and Gardens, they're actually going to be putting a little handshake icon on all of our websites under all of our listings so that you could click the little handshake and see. It's called OOBC, offers of broker compensation. So you can click it and it will show what the percentage is pulled based on the information pulled from Dash. So all your websites will have it. So if any agent wants to see what the compensation is that's being offered, they can go there and look at that if something is being offered. But the way the contracts are written now, there's not anything being offered, so you don't necessarily have that amount to put in. And they can't have what Better Homes and Gardens can't do is they couldn't take all of our listings and aggregate them onto one site. It would have to just be by individual brokers. So just what's under Desert Lifestyle Properties could be aggregated under one site. But the way the contracts are written, I thought that was going to be how we were going to do it too, but I just don't see that information is even in the contract for us to pull and enter into Dash or SkySlope or anywhere else that we would be able to use it. So I don't know exactly what that part's going to look like. The one thing I do want to share with you in the MLS, in the residential listing, the listing agreement, is that the MLS section has been completely removed. It is its own document now. The MLS section used to be like a whole like part of a page. It was like 3/4 of a page, and now it's 2 pages. I am pretty sure we're going to make this a required form because it is already part of the listing agreement. Or it was part of the current listing agreement, but I haven't talked to Ben yet about it, and I want to double check with him to make sure that he wants to make it required. There's nothing to fill in on it. There's a couple check boxes, but there is an ELM section in it. I'm not sure if we're going to require this one, but I wanted to just let you guys know that that MLS section of the listing agreement is completely removed. So I don't know. I feel like we're probably going to make this one required. I just don't want to say that out loud yet. But no, it's there. If you have a client that has questions about the MLS and how that works, which I know very few people do, but if you do have that, this would be the form that you would want to go to and reference. I'll let you know when I find out from Ben if it's going to be required. It will go, if it's required, it will go into the checklist. And it wouldn't be required for any current transactions. It would just be required for new transactions if we were going to do that. But I'll let you guys know. I'm not exactly sure yet. I just at least wanted to let you see that form. The next one is the DMBR. So this is the disclosure and modification to a buyer representation agreement. So just like the listing agreement, if you guys have a buyer rep agreement currently and you don't want to change it, and you don't want to write a new one, you can modify it with this one. And this isn't to extend past the 3-month period that we talked about. This is for old buyer representation agreements. So buyer rep agreements that you've had signed before today, you can see it says intended for use with the BRBC that was revised 12/22 or earlier, and that's the revision date on the form. And that's the last form that we had. So if you have a current buyer rep agreement, that's the form you're going to want to use. This is the old buyer or the new buyer representation agreement. And on this, there's a lot of red. We're not going to go through it because if you've sat in any of the other classes we've done, you've already heard 90% of what's on here. The beautiful thing is, again, they used the grid. They brought all the important information to the front. The one thing I want to tap on again that's really important is the type of representation. By default, this form is non-exclusive. If you do not check the box to make it exclusive, which I personally feel like every one of you will probably check 95% of the time. If someone's really uncomfortable and didn't want to, and you're still willing to go show the property with a non-exclusive agreement, then that's fine. Somebody said, why would I ever do that? And I'm like, I don't know. Why do you guys go do it now? You show properties non-exclusively to people all the time without buyer rep agreements. So we're just now being honest about what we're doing with each other, right? So, there may be times where you'll use it, but I think in most cases, you'll check that box and want that box checked. What you do need to know, though, is if you check that box, you also need to have them initial this paragraph, paragraph 15, exclusive representation. It says in this paragraph that the agreement is exclusive, that they cannot enter into agreement with another person. So you can't just check the box at the top and not have them initial down here in this section. You have to do both. It's redundant, I know it. And the next paragraph after this is redundant too, but we're going to come back to it. So you're going to want to check that box for exclusive. The difference between exclusive and non-exclusive. With exclusive, right to represent, you do not have to do the work. Does that make sense? I mean, someone else could do the work and you are still owed to get paid. They may technically owe two commissions and compensation to two people, but even if you don't do the work with an exclusive agreement, you have the right to be paid. Non-exclusive means you have to have done the work. And there are 4 types of things that you can do to show that you have done the work. Let's go back in here, broker right to compensation. So broker involvement, it's physically entered and showed the property, that you showed the property virtually. You can do a virtual showing. It cannot be, and it actually says in here that it cannot be that you just sent them a list of properties or sent them a video. You had to have done a virtual showing or a live showing, that you submitted to the seller a signed written offer for the buyer to purchase the property, that you performed a market analysis related to the property, or that the property was introduced to the buyer or broker was introduced to the buyer by the broker. And that's actually more than 4 things. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 things that you can do in order to be compensated. But with that list, more than one agent could do those things, right? If you notice on here, it says or. You could have one agent that shows the property. You could have one agent that did a virtual showing. You could have one agent that wrote the offer and submitted it. You could have one agent that did a market analysis. This is not clear. So understand that it doesn't necessarily mean that you're secured because you showed the property, doesn't mean you're secured to get a commission. You could get, if this went to court, you could get a quarter of the commission if 4 agents did 4 things that actually contributed, right? So I think that's why you still want to go the exclusive route. And you just need to know that if you check that exclusive box, you have to make sure you get them to initial on that second page. But it doesn't mean you have to do the work to get paid. That's the important part. I'm going to suggest again, this document, the BRBC, is going to have to be signed with every single property you show. So if you show a property to a client, you have to use this document. There is an exception. There's another document you can use, and I'm going to introduce that one to you guys because I think you might end up using it sometimes. But get familiar with this one. This is another one that you need to like pour a glass of wine, print it out, sit down and read it because you need to know this document front and back. It's going to be very important. There's not a lot of other changes based on the last few classes we've had. I know there's a lot of red in here and it's just a lot of writing. I do think you guys all need to read it and you need to know it well, but I've said that enough times. I am going to come back here to this last section, section 16. This is where you do confirmation of compensation. I was going through this with somebody yesterday and they said, you mean I just have to write it twice? And I was like, yep. And you have to get them to check the box and initial this paragraph right above it too. You have to, it's very redundant, but you're going to put in here what the dollar amount or what that amount of compensation is that you're going to be paid for. So did you write this at 3% or 2.5%? It's basically just a confirmation of what you said before so that you're making sure that they see it on the same page where they're signing as opposed to just initialing. As I'm reading through these documents, you guys, this is just so reminiscent to me that every time there's a lawsuit, there's more, like one more page to a document. You can see all these paragraphs that have been added and what all the reasons are. And it's a little bit more paperwork, but it does make things a little more clear. So I know it can be a little frustrating and a little overwhelming. If you guys are having challenges or as you're starting to fill out these BRBCs, please don't hesitate to just call me and have me go over it with you. I'm happy to be on the phone while you're filling it out. I'm happy to have you send it to me and I'll look at it real quick before you go out with a client. Just don't try to do it by yourself if you've never done it before. It can be a little confusing and I don't want you to get into a situation where you didn't secure your right to get paid. Let's see, next document is going to be the MTBR. So this is the modification terms of the buyer representation agreement. So you guys have asked me before, I have some really good news and I'm very happy about it. You guys have asked me before because right on that buyer rep agreement, it says it can't be longer than 3 months. And as a matter of fact, sorry, I'm going to go back to this one more time. It says right here, not to exceed 3 months. It said it up here. Oh, we took it out of the bold verbiage, but it does say not to exceed 3 months. So what you need to know on your buyer rep agreement is, let's say you were going to do it August 1st. The longest it could go would be August, September, October, and it wouldn't be November 1st. You would want to make it October 31st. If you make it November 1st, your contract is void. And I'm just giving a little silence there for a second because I want to let that sink in. If you write it for 1 day over 3 months, your contract is void. And if you have a void contract, it means you do not have a right to collect compensation. So please, please, please get that part right. It's very important that you get the dates right. If you're confused, aren't sure, send me the dates, text me, call me. I'm happy to help you figure it out just to make sure you have the right thing in there. But don't make it 1 day over 3 months or it won't be valid. But the good news is that you can use a modification of terms for the list for the buyer representation agreement. And now there is an MT specifically for the buyer representation agreement that you can use to extend it. So you can't extend it for more than another 90 days, but you can just do a modification of terms if you want to keep that contract valid. You guys excited? Yay. Maybe not, but that's okay. At least you don't have to do a whole new document. Okay, so let's see. We'll get to the next one is document 7, which is the cancellation of the buyer's representation agreement. Wanted you guys to see this because I just wanted you to know that there's a specific cancellation just for the buyer rep agreement. We don't need to review it. You'll probably not use it very frequently, but maybe you will. And if you ever need it, now you know it's there. It's called the C.A.R. Property showing agreement. Okay, this one is the one that you could use in lieu of the BRBC. Now, it's not as solid as the BRBC, and I think your buyer rep agreement is a much better document to use. However, I've already had a couple phone calls from people who presented a buyer rep agreement to somebody and they balked at signing it. It was the interesting thing with that one is it was only written for the 3 properties they were going to go see that day, and the client wouldn't sign it. And boy, if that isn't a red flag. Like, why wouldn't you want me to get paid on the 3 things I'm going to go show you today? This doesn't bind you to anything else. So they ended up not going out and seeing it. And the agent was fine with it, but I wasn't. Like, I never want the result of our documentation to be that you lose a client. And I don't think he lost the client. They just didn't go out that particular day. But this document is for use with a prospective buyer for up to 3 open houses or other properties only. So if you're going to go out with a client and you're going to go into an open house with them, or you're going to go take a look at 2 or 3 properties that day, you could use this form and you identify the 3 properties on it. It can't be for any more than that. And you would just make this for those 3 properties. Now, again, if the guy wasn't going to sign the BRBC with 3 properties listed on it, is he going to sign this with 3 properties not listed on it? Probably not. But maybe there's a reason. Maybe in that conversation you have with the client, we uncover, like, what's the challenge? Because my first question when somebody won't sign something is, tell me what about that document bothers you, or what causes you pause in signing it. And as soon as they start to tell me, I may find something that this document will allow us to solve that it doesn't include, because it is non-exclusive. And yeah, it's only if there was broker involvement, which is why you have this form. And there's another form that goes along with it that you can use as confirmation that you showed the properties. I'm not going to get into that form today, but if you've ever felt like, you know what, I'm just feeling shaky about whether this client is going to continue working with me, call me right away. There's forms we can use. There's stuff we can do that we can put into play. Can we force anybody to sign things? No. But there's stuff that we can use, and there's conversations we can have with clients that are helped. So I don't know how often you'll use this one. My preference is that you guys use the BRBC, but there may be times where this one's appropriate, and I don't think that we should just shove it to the side and not look at it. The NBIP is the notice of broker involved properties. This is what I was just referring to, where you can give the client that shows these are all of the properties that we looked at. This is the time where my representation expires on, or you know how long it goes, and it just allows you to kind of confirm all those conversations. Do I think you guys are going to use this every time? Absolutely not. But every now and again, I feel like there'll be a use for it, and I thought it was worth showing you guys today really quickly. The next is the residential purchase agreement. And what we're going to get into on this, because I'm going to just scroll through it real quick so you can see there's not a lot of red in this one. As a matter of fact, is there any red in this one? Maybe there's a little bit at the back. Yeah, there's not. Since the changes in June, which was 30 days ago, there are no new changes to the RPA. The one thing I want to point out on here, though, the only thing I really want us to look at is just making sure that you guys understand G1, G2, and G3. G1 is the seller credit, if any, to the buyer. This is the dollar amount that they would be willing to put up in concessions, or that the buyer is asking the seller to give in concessions. So this normally doesn't include the compensation. This is for closing costs, or we will write in 3% for recurring and non-recurring closing costs. That's generally where this is going to go. If you're talking about compensation, we're going to skip down to G3. You do have G2, which you can use to put in if you need to put notes or something else that you're not able to fit in here. You can put that in additional finance terms. But in G3 is where we have the checkbox that the seller agrees to pay the buyer's obligation to compensate the buyer's broker under a separate agreement, and you have to use form SPBB. And so you guys are pretty much going to need to check this box on every single offer. Well, not pretty much. You're going to need to check this box on every offer. I can't see a time where you don't. This needs to get checked. It will be checked in the template. I will also add in the SPBB, and I will add in any other additional documents that need to be added. And we'll go to the SPBB next. That's the next document we're going to look at, actually. So you guys will be checking that on every one. The SPBB, they did make some adjustments to it, and speak candid, I kind of liked, well, yeah, they took out the fact that it said you had to have a buyer representation agreement. That verbiage is gone, but it does say here, if there's no buyer representation agreement, then seller has no obligation to pay buyer's broker. So this is where you cannot use the SPBB if you don't have a BRBC. Okay, you can't ask the seller to pay the buyer's compensation, the buyer's broker compensation, if the buyer doesn't have an agreement to pay compensation. Does that make sense? That's why a buyer representation agreement is required before you ever even get to the purchase agreement stage, right? Like we have to have it to go show the property. That's required. And not by me, it's required by the state of California that we have a written agreement if we're going to go show property. Once we get to the written stage, you have to include the SPVB and you have to include the first page of the BRBC. Is it the first page? This is the last page of the BRBC. That's changed since our last conversation, and I'll take a look at that. I really thought it was the first page because that shows the, oh no, that's why they have the confirmation of compensation on the last page now. That's why they added it. Okay, let's go back and take a quick look at this. Where did it go? No, it's not that one. Oh, I can't see it because of that window. Okay, so we were just talking about this where it's duplicate, where you have to sign it twice. This is why, because a month ago, they were going to ask you to submit the first page of the buyer rep agreement, which I thought was stupid because you can't see that it's signed, right? The first page doesn't mean anything. This is why they added confirmation number 16 to the back page, because it shows what the compensation is that's being paid and shows the buyer signature on it. So you only have to provide the last page of the BRBC now. But you do have to have that along with the SPVB with your offer. So these are going to be included every single time. This is the big change, guys. This is it. This is the most painful part of all of it, is that we have to include these with every offer so that you're going to be showing what that looks like. If you guys need help with this the first time you're doing it, please don't try to do it alone. Just call me. I'm happy to help walk you through it. But that really is the most complicated part of what you're going to have to do with paperwork. It's going to be a little different than what you've done in the past. Any questions before I move on? I know I'm kind of flying through this, but I really today, guys, I only want you to kind of get a feel for what this looks like. You're going to have to do some more reading and some more scripting and getting your conversations together, and it's going to take more work. Again, we were going to do a bunch of this stuff, but because everything changed, we really couldn't sit down and do any of the role playing, but I think now is the time for us to get back into that. One other thing I do want to share with you, though, that I thought was important is this open house visitor non-agency disclosure sign-in. The open house sign-in form that I've brought up a couple times. And I know there's been some talk about this, and that one of the questions that has been asked of me is, do I have to have every person sign into my open house? And the short answer is no, you do not. The only time that someone needs to sign in or that someone needs to sign a contract with you is if they decide they want to work with you, okay? And so on the webinars from C.A.R, where they had the C.A.R legal counsel on and the forums people talking, what they explained was that as long as the person coming into the open house understands that you work for the buyer, and even if, let's say it's not your open house, let's say it's Ray is hosting Craig's listing this weekend, and it's Craig's listing, but Ray's holding the open house. As long as the client knows that you work for the buyer or that we work for the buyer, and you can still say Ray would work for the buyer because he works for the same brokerage that the buyer is with, that the buyer, the person coming into the open house just needs to understand that we don't work for them, that we work for the seller, right? Is once they want to engage us in conversation that leans towards us working with them, then we need to establish an agency agreement. Then we need to establish a contract. And so do they walk in and they ask you a question about the property? Can you give answers about the property? Yes, you can give answers about the property. You can do anything in the best interest of the seller. But the moment you start to have the interest of the buyer in mind, you need to have an agreement in place to work with them. Does that make sense? So if they come into your open house and they start asking questions and they're like, okay, well, we really like this house. We think we'd like to make an offer. Okay, great. Would you like me to write that for you? Yes, we would. Okay, now you need to have a different conversation. Does that make sense? But if somebody's like, hey, I noticed this closet in the back of the house, I wanted to take a closer look at it, and you walk back and they start asking you questions about the property. Now do you need to engage them in a contract? No, you still work for the seller and you're doing everything in the best interest of the seller. Once you feel the obligation, and once you know that the obligation is there, that you need to have the buyer's interest in mind, now you need to have a contract with them. Does that help? Does that make sense? Make open houses a little less scary for you guys?
What about for What about for when I do for different brokerages? I do open houses for different brokerages.
Yeah, so I will say that my preference is that you guys are holding our listings open, and here's why. And it doesn't mean that you can't. We definitely allow you to do open houses at other brokerages, but there is some liability that comes into play. And to be honest, it's a lot less of a concern for me when you're holding somebody else's open than when an outside broker, an outside agent is holding one of our listings open, simply because they may come in and do something that creates liability for us. And so I want to be careful about that. But if you are holding an open house for someone who is if you're holding an open house for someone for a listing that's not ours, I feel like I don't feel like it's too much different in that you don't necessarily have to have a contract with them until you need to have their best interest in mind. So again, it's the same conversation. Like, they say, hey, I like this house. I think great. Would you like to make an offer? Yes. Would you like me to write it for you? Wonderful. Okay. Now we need to have a separate conversation. You're still, as the host of the open house, even if it's not your listing or it's not at your brokerage, you're still operating in the best interest of the seller. You just don't, and that's actually why we don't like it when outside agents do those, because you don't have any obligation to the seller. And so it's really not in the seller's best interest for me to have a Compass agent hold my listing open, because they have no obligation to that seller. So it's why we don't, like, I'm not excited about having outside agents hold our listings open or vice versa, but we tend to, I don't know, we don't tend to be as strict in that as some other brokerages that I know of. I know some other brokerages just simply won't allow it. And that's why. It's for the liability purpose.
Thanks for the confirmation.
Huh?
Thanks for the confirmation.
Of course. Any other questions on that? I know the open house part I think that's the part that's given most people most anxiety about when we need to have a contract, what that looks like. And if you have any concerns over it, don't hesitate to reach out to me. But again, I feel like you guys are going to be able to navigate this fairly easily. You'll figure out when it's time, and you'll know when people start having conversations with you that sounds like we need to be sitting down at a table to talk, then it's probably time for us to start talking about a representation agreement. The challenging part is going to be getting that scripted piece in, because it didn't used to be part of the conversation, right? It just used to be, okay, let's go talk about what your needs are. But now it needs to be, okay, let's also talk about what happens when I represent you. We should have been having that conversation up front, especially if we were representing the seller as well. But we weren't necessarily. So again, do you need to use this form? No, you don't need to use it. It's there to help you. There's also a version of this form that doesn't have the sign in that you could actually hand to somebody in your open house. So if you're still uncomfortable with the verbiage and the dialogue, print a couple of those out that you can just hand out to people in your open house, so that if you aren't sure what to do, at least you have them there for yourself. And it can help you to guide that conversation. All right. I know I went through a lot of that fast. There's one other thing I wanted to show you in here, was the modification of terms for the listing agreement. I know you guys all know how to do this, but I just wanted to show you the it's now MTLA as opposed to just modification of terms. So there's one for the buyer rep agreement and there's one for the listing agreement, and those are completely separate because they have different verbiage on them. So that's it. I don't think I have anything else to go over with you. Again, I know we can go into more depth in these, but I feel like for the most part, you guys are going to really take this in as you're starting to use them. And just know that we're expecting you to call us. I'm already getting lots of phone calls, and I am helping people write offers and helping people figure out how to put things together and even figure out how to have conversations with clients. I know Ben's doing a lot of that himself. And I don't want you to feel like it's overwhelming. Like it's really not. I think it's all kind of simplified since the last set of forms that they gave us. That was a little too complicated, and I'm actually glad they made the edits that they made. But we're here to help, and we're happy to help. And if you guys need help with any of these forms as you're writing them, don't hesitate to reach out to us. Any questions?
I think Jessica had a question in the chat area.
Oh my gosh, I didn't see it. Yeah, thank you for the heads up. Let me go look. On MLS, can we advise agents to go to the BHGRE website to see cooperating broker compensation? You can right now for the ones that had, so yes, for the listings that had compensation, that currently, the listing contracts that currently have that compensation in them, that we've said that they're going to offer 3% to the buy side, and that's what's in the MLS. It will be available. I don't know that the handshake piece is there yet, so I'll have to go double check, and I would guess that it probably isn't there yet. But that's only going to be good for so long, because once we no longer have contracts in play that had broker compensation to the other side, because the new ones don't, then there won't be any of that information to display unless we're still asking the question, getting the information, in some places potentially writing it into the listing agreement. But that's not the intention of what the new forms are supposed to do. So I would suggest you do everything you can to try it the other way. If you get to a really stuck place and you can't quite negotiate with the client and figure it out, and they're really wanting to see that in there, just reach out to me and I'll let you know the best way to write it into the contract so that you can do it and try to avoid liability for yourself and us.
One last question to that point.
Yeah.
Just to clarify, moving forward with new listings coming out a week from now, are we able to put in the remarks on MLS? You can check the BHG website for cooperating broker compensation offerings.
So I will tell you that C.A.R, and I believe GPSR has done the same thing. C.A.R just, their board of directors voted to disallow the word compensation anywhere in public or private remarks. And we're allowing C.A.R, and this is by association, so everyone is different. C.A.R is allowing the word concession because we always have, but there is an immediate $1,500 fine for anyone who uses the word compensation in the remarks. And I will tell you, as someone who fought against being a member of C.A.R MLS simply because their fines tend to be $500 to $1,500, and they are immediate and there's nothing you can do about them. I am generally against fines like that, but with the amount of liability that the association will face if agents are using that MLS that the association owns to conduct business and share compensation through the MLS when we've explicitly been told by the Department of Justice not to, they will be fined $1,500, and if they continue, they will be removed from the multiple listing service. That's
Okay,
GPSR. GPSR will not allow the word compensation anywhere in their marketing remarks. We are both GPSR and C.A.R are removing any compensation fields, and they are not going to put a yes or no concession box in the MLS. The reason for that, and again, I learned this at the board meeting that I sat through last week, is that we know C.A.R MLS is going to. They're putting in a radio button that will let you say that concessions will, yes or no, that the seller will consider concessions. The reason that C.A.R MLS is doing it is because they're frigging huge. And they can afford to, and they know it. They've actually said out loud, we know we are putting our neck on the line. We have our lawyers ready and we're ready to go. The little MLSs like Palm Springs and California Desert, because C.A.R MLS is California regional, right? Like they're the biggest MLS in California. They have the backing and the power. The little ones, we know that if we get sued, we're done. We can't, we won't be able to afford the legal fees, let alone what it's going to take to fix it. So we are all kind of, and not just C.A.R and GPSR, like a bunch of them in California are sort of watching what happens with C.A.R MLS to see if it's okay for us to put that field in. We're letting them do it and take the heat, and then we'll see if it's okay for us to do it.
Okay, so to mitigate our risk and limit that liability, we shouldn't even say that the seller's offering concessions and visit the website.
You can say that they're willing to offer concessions, but you cannot indicate that it's like, please don't pretend, like, don't do the jokey thing where you're like, the 3-bedroom is perfect. Like, don't do that. Right. It's not a good look. And they will be looking, they will be watching us. So just be aware of it. Like I hope that they don't. We just got a notification, I think a while ago, for somebody that got a violation up in the high desert. And I said, well, I promise you the real estate commissioner wasn't driving around up there this weekend in Joshua Tree, but it was probably some of your competition, which means that your clients probably also saw it as well, right? So we don't have to worry that they're in our territory mostly, but they will watch us on social media. They will look at our MLS. They will check and see what we're doing in places. And we are allowed to offer compensation outside of the MLS, so don't forget that. If your seller says, yeah, I'm going to offer 3%, you're more than willing to share it. I would suggest you have it in writing somewhere, even if it's just an email, so that you can, am I allowed to share this? Am I allowed to use this information to promote the listing? In most cases, they're going to say yes. And I bet you're going to have a lot of sellers that are going to be like, yeah, we still want to pay that compensation. We absolutely want to offer 3%. We want to make sure that that other side gets paid and that the buyer has representation. We don't want the liability if they don't. Those people want to shout it from the rooftops. They're going to want you to shout it from the rooftops. So we're going to have to get creative outside of the MLS on how we do that, but we have lots of ways of doing it, you know. And again, reach out to me, reach out to Jeff. We have some ideas on things we can do to market your properties, and help you to get that information out when you need to. What else? What other questions do we have? Nothing else? You guys are all good? Nobody's going to call me when you need to write one up?
I have a question. When you extend your listing agreement, can you extend it for another 3 months, or does it have to be?
Listing agreements that's a great question. So listing agreements cannot be longer than 12 months. It says that right here on the modification of terms. Buyer rep agreements can't be longer than 3, but listing agreements can be 12 months long. And that's important. It is a change over the last few years. You used to be able to do them for 24, and before that, there was no limit on them. The reason there's a limit is that there were some unscrupulous real estate agents that were signing 100-year listing agreements and then putting liens on the property. So when somebody went to sell it, they were owed compensation. That is why the DOJ came in and stopped us from being able to have unlimited listing periods. It went to 24 and now it's 12. So just be aware of that. Don't write it longer. I've have lease agreements that I've written for 2 years, lease listings that I've written for 2 years, just because I know I've had it forever and I'm going to keep it. But that's not the jam anymore. You're going to need to make sure that you only do those for 12 months.
And for the buyer, you have to re-up every 3 months.
Yep. Yeah, and that's, you know, I'm going to tell you guys, I really think we need to look at that buyer rep agreement differently than we ever have before. It can be a much more casual thing than the way we've used it. And I kind of use the dating analogy. I always joke that it's like, if we just, you know, tell each other what we're doing, are we exclusive? Are we non-exclusive? Are we just going to look at one property? Is this just sushi? Are we going to get ice cream later? Maybe a movie? Or like, we just need to be clear with what we're doing. And as long as we're all honest about it, it's okay. If the client says, hey, I'm not good with signing an agreement. Have you ever had somebody say that and you were like, yeah, I'll go show it to you anyway? Or have you ever shown a property without the buyer rep agreement? I mean, you can't do that now, but because you have to have it, the non-exclusive option is almost necessary for some people, right? And then you can show that you showed the property, you pulled comps on it, you did all the things. If you can show 3 or 4 of those things, then you've probably done a pretty good job to secure your compensation. I wouldn't just do one of those things on the buyer rep agreement that we talked about, the things that you can do to get paid, these items, broker involvement. I would make sure you've done, 3 to 5 of those items on that list. If you've done that, I feel like you probably have done a pretty good job to solidify your ability to collect compensation if you're doing non-exclusive. But get comfortable with the idea of that. What would it look like if you did non-exclusive? What of these items do you think you could get knocked off the list quickly so that you'd feel like you secured your compensation fast, right? And then the other thing is, we got to make sure we get these BRBCs before we go show any property. Don't ask me how I'm supposed to police that. I don't know. I'm not going to come to your house and check your database and find out who you're showing property to. That's just not going to happen. Or come to the Palm Springs office and go through your desk and see who your clients are. I am going to make it a place for you guys to be able to put buyer reps into SkySlope so that you can upload them right away, if you'd like to. But I am not going to make them required in SkySlope until you are starting a new transaction. That will be the time that it gets triggered for us. So it's important to Ben and I that we work with people we can trust and people that we know are going to do business properly. And we're counting on you to have contracts with all your clients and follow the law like your contract says that you will. So you definitely need to do that. But if you having a challenge with it, and you don't need to have it until you show the property. So you can go to the property, get the contract signed, and then go in and show the property. And it could just be for that one property. And if a client tells you like, look, I don't want to sign this, just ask them, what about it makes you uncomfortable? Because we can adjust it to make it so that it fits, so that it does meet your needs. So tell me what makes it uncomfortable. Why do I want to be bound to you to work on everything? Well, this is just for these 3 properties. Well, I don't really want to be bound with you to work on these 3 properties. Well, then why are we here today? Like, why did I get dressed? This doesn't take 5 minutes. Right? So we need to and it's probably best if you're having that conversation before you get to the property. This is going to be a little bit of a new way that we got to do business. I don't want it to feel like I'm just blowing smoke, like, oh, everything's fine, nothing's changed. I get it. I know it's a change. I know it's going to be significant. And I know that there will be some transactions that you may not be able to serve a client because this isn't the same way that it used to be done. And I'm not going to tell you that's okay. I'm not okay with that. I want to figure out all the ways that we can to make sure that this works so that you guys can get paid on every transaction possible and that you're able to help as many people as possible. So, as I said before, if I set a bunch of policies for you today, I think in 30 days, they'd be out the window. So I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to ask you guys to follow the law and do what we know we're supposed to do. And then as you run into challenges, reach out to me, let me know. We will help you create solutions. I have, and between Ben and I, we have a network of not just all of the brokers in the Coachella Valley, but resources across the state. You guys all know I have resources at C.A.R. And so if we come up with challenges, we'll figure them all out together, and just know you're not in it alone. And we're here to help. Is that helpful? Did anybody get any ahas out of today? Like, can anybody share with me what their takeaway was from today? Anything new that you might have learned?
I'm wondering, you said something about doing some role playing. Is that something you'll be doing soon? That might be kind of helpful.
Yes. Yeah, I think we do need to do that. So let's just do this. I'm going to get real and just show you all my calendar. Let's see what I got. Lots of time next week. It's pretty open. So I kind of feel like, what day of the week do you guys is best for you to do trainings? I sort of like Thursday afternoons, but maybe that's not like, either Tuesdays or Thursdays. I always feel like seem best to me, but you guys tell me, what, if you had to pick a day to do some role play and get together in the office, what day would you pick?
Monday, Tuesday, or Wednesday.
Okay. I try to stay away from Mondays because I feel like most people are crazy on Mondays. Mondays are good for me, but
Say Thursdays.
Yeah, Tuesday, Thursday, good.
okay. All right. Well, Taylor, do Thursdays ever work for you?
They do, but I can't be here past 2:30 because of my other job.
Okay. Okay, good to know. And I want you involved. So Tuesdays might be a little bit better if we did something like that. I'm kind of thinking what I'd like to do is just maybe set like a schedule every other week for us to just do something. And even if it's not always in Palm Springs or here or Zoom or whatever, that we just set something where we can all kind of get together on a regular basis. All right, I'm going to do that. And we'll do it, let's say, for like the next 2 months so that we just have a set time for all of us to get together if we want to. Do you prefer live or do you prefer Zoom?
I prefer live.
I like live.
Okay. Do you have a preference for the office location?
Clearly here, but I'm
And
open.
I'm good with it. Like, I feel, I'm looking at the screen. That's what I was doing. I was actually counting who do I have on from Palm Springs, and it is most of you. So, and I tend to get a little better turnout lately live with Palm Springs. So we probably will do them in Palm Springs like we were going to with some of the role plays. Do you guys want to do the buyer rep agreement first, or do you want to do the listing agreement first?
I'm not picky.
Either
Yeah.
one.
Either one, but buyer would be good.
Buyer.
Okay. Yeah, I think let's do the buyer first, and then we'll do the listing agreement. Okay. All right, I'll get it on my calendar. I'll get some dates out to you guys. I'll get this recording done along with all the attachments. Any other questions? Oh, Craig said live in Palm Desert. I hear you. You and I could do a private session.
Later.
All right, guys. Okay, well, we're done a little bit early today. I gave us an hour and a half just in case we needed it, so I'll give you 20 minutes of your life back. And if you have any questions in the meantime, like before I get these next classes put together, don't hesitate to reach out. We're happy to help.
Thank you.
All right,
Thank
guys,
you,
I hope this
Stephanie.
helped you. Have a great day.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Bye.